Welcome to Lecture 21 of CS 182. Today, we're going to talk about a new topic called MetaLearning. MetaLearning is an approach that we can use to make it possible to use deep learning techniques with very, very small data sets. So here's the idea behind MetaLearning. Deep learning works very well when you have very large amounts of data. And we've learned this since the very first lecture in this course. When you have lots of data, very large models, you can do really well using deep learning techniques. But what if you only have a little bit of data for a new task? Now, it's not actually so straightforward to apply conventional deep learning methods. So what can we do? Well, one idea is that if we have plentiful data from other previously seen tasks that are somehow similar to the current task, perhaps we can use them not to learn the new task, but rather to learn how to learn. And then using this understanding of how to learn efficiently, we can learn the new task more efficiently even from small amounts of data. So if these prior tasks present challenges that are somehow structurally similar to the challenge presented by the new task, maybe they're all image recognition tasks or something like that, then perhaps we can use those prior tasks to learn something about the learning process itself. And that can allow us to be more efficient and more performant on this new task, even when only a small amount of data is available. So MetaLearning basically refers to the process of learning how to learn. This is nicely illustrated by this picture that I borrowed from Kali, where he's showing standard gradient descent. It says like, well, I'm going to follow the gradient. But following the gradient results in some bad stuff happening. So maybe your learned, or your meta-learned optimizer might say, well, I've seen these kinds of bad optimization situations before. I know how to recover from previous problems that I've solved. But of course, that's not the only thing that you can learn from prior data. You can, of course, you can learn something about the optimization process, but you can also learn something about the kinds of prior knowledge that are useful for solving tasks. For example, you can learn something about visual features that are useful. You can learn something about objects and other visual concepts that might be really helpful for learning how to recognize images. So all of these things fall under the purview of learning how to learn. And in practice, meta-learning is very closely related to multitask learning. So the setup that we're going to work with in this lecture is one where you have a large number of prior tasks. Maybe each of those prior tasks themselves have a small amount of data, but the number of tasks is large. And then you have some new task that is structurally related, and we'll define what structurally related means a little bit later. There are many ways to formulate meta-learning. You can formulate it as learning an optimizer, learning an RNN that reads in prior data or prior experience, learning a representation, and so forth. We're mainly going to focus on a subset of meta-learning problems called few-shot learning problems. Few-shot learning refers to the problem of learning a new task using a small number of examples called shots. Few-shot means few examples. Okay, so why is meta-learning a good idea? Well, deep learning works well, but it requires very large data sets. And in many cases, we might have only a small amount of data available. For example, we might have only a little bit of data for some particular medical imaging diagnosis task. But we might have lots of data of a similar type for other tasks, like other kinds of image recognition tasks. So how does meta-learning help with this? Well, meta-learning uses plentiful prior tasks to meta-train a model that can learn a new task quickly with only a few examples. Which means that you only need to collect a small amount of labeled data for the new task, and then use your meta-learned model to quickly adapt to this task and then solve it. Okay, so this might at first seem a little bit abstract and a little cryptic, but one very, very powerful technique that can allow us to get a handle on meta-learning is to simply recast the meta-learning problem as just a supervised learning problem at another level. So that's what this illustration is trying to show. And let me walk you through what this illustration means. This illustration is showing how we can formulate a few-shot image recognition task as a meta-learning problem. So few-shot image recognition means that you get a small number of examples of every class, and then you need to very quickly use that small number of examples to learn to recognize new objects of that class. And this particular illustration is actually illustrating the one-shot case, the case where you get only one example of each class. So For example, the top row represents a training set with only 5 images, very, very small training set, where your task is to distinguish between birds, mushrooms, dogs, people, and pianos. Okay. I don't know why someone wants to distinguish between those things, but let's say that you're a company that makes image classifiers and your customer goes to you and says, what I want is birds versus mushrooms versus dogs versus people versus pianos. And I only have one example of each of those things. Can you get me a classifier? So the idea in framing meta-learning or few-shot learning as just another supervised learning task is to take things one level up. What we're going to say is that we have a meta-training set which itself consists of many different data sets, each of which is, in this case, a one-shot classification task. Okay, so in the meta-training set, you have many, many tasks, maybe thousands of tasks, and each of those tasks is determined by a little training set, in this case a one-shot training set, so just 5 images, and a little test set with a few images that belong to those same classes. So maybe your first meta-training task is birds versus mushrooms versus dogs versus people versus pianos, and the corresponding test set has a couple of images corresponding to these classes. And then your second meta-training task is gymnasts, landscapes, tanks, barrels, and carnivals, right? Okay. In practice, maybe these tasks would be a little more coherent. These are kind of random, but that hopefully gets you the idea. And what we've done by creating this data set of data sets is we've recast the problem of few-shot classification into the problem of reading in a little 5-image one-shot training set and making predictions on new test images. If we can train a model to handle this, then at meta-test time, we'll be presented with a new set of 5 images, a new one-shot training set, with classes that we've never seen before. So maybe at meta-test time, this is when the customer actually wants to adapt this to a new task. They show one image of ice cream, one image of a dog, one image of a lion, one image of a worm, and one image of a bowl. Okay? And maybe some of these classes have been seen before, but generally you assume that these are new classes. They haven't been seen before. So the model has learned to quickly figure out how to classify different groups of 5, and now it's shown a new group of 5 with classes that is not seen before, but the structure of the task is similar. They're all images. The formal assumption that we need for this idea to make sense is we need the meta-training set to be sampled from some distribution over tasks. So this is now not just a distribution of images, it's actually a distribution over tasks. And the meta-testing tasks need to come from that same distribution. So it's just like taking the supervised learning assumption and moving it one level up. Okay. If this seems a little bit abstract, don't worry. I'm going to go over particular models for doing this, and then it might become a little bit more obvious. Okay, so in supervised learning, at a very, very high level, we learn some function f that maps from inputs x to outputs y. So your input might be, for example, an image, and your output y might be a label. In meta-learning, we learn a function that maps from a training set that I'm going to refer to as dtrain and a test image y, and a test image x, sorry, to its corresponding label y. Okay, so before we just learned a mapping from x to y, now we're learning a mapping from a training set dtrain and x to y. And for different tasks, we would give this f function a different dtrain. Now this is kind of a funny way to look at learning. It just says learning a new task is just a function. And you apply that function to the training set and the test image, and it's supposed to produce the label of the test image. Now, of course, in reality, we might want to decompose that function. We might want to break it up somehow so that we first read in just dtrain, produce some sufficient statistics or parameters, which we can then use to classify many different x's. But that's kind of just a convenience. In terms of actually defining the problem, we can define it perfectly well just like this. And if we were talking about regular learning algorithms that we've already covered in this class, like gradient descent, then f would just be a function that takes dtrain, runs gradient descent to convergence on it, takes the resulting parameters, and then uses them to classify x. But in meta-learning, it helps to represent f in many other ways too. So take a moment to think about how can you represent f? If I just told you, well, you need to just learn some function that takes in dtrain and x and outputs a label y. How might you represent this function? Forget for a moment that this has anything to do with meta-learning. I'm just telling you, your new learning problem now is dtrain comma x goes to y, and dtrain is a set of images and their labels. How could you represent f? Are there any models that we've already learned about in this course that could allow you to represent f? What if you view dtrain as a sequence of images and labels? If you view it as a sequence, are there any techniques that we've already covered that could be used to represent f? So dtrain is a training set. It's a set of images and their labels. In order to set up f, we need to answer a few questions. The first question is, how do we read in the training set? How does f actually ingest? How does f actually read in all of dtrain? There are many options for doing this. RNNs could work well. Transformers could work well. But there are other choices too. But just to keep things simple, let's say that we're going to use an RNN, like an LSTM. Okay? So we can frame our training set, our dtrain, as just a sequence. x1, y1, x2, y2, x3, y3. And we would create a sequence. We can pick some arbitrary ordering on these points. We can create a sequence that will, out of the training set, we can read in that sequence one xy tuple at a time, and then we can have a little head at the end that reads in the test image and makes a prediction on that test image. So that is a perfectly reasonable way to set up a meta-learning method. And then you can train this little RNN or LSTM on every task in your meta-training set. So for the example in the image, since all the training sets have 5 images, it's a one-shot, 5-way classification task, you would have sequences of length 5. And then you would have a separate little network that takes in the last hidden state of your RNN and the test input, the test image, like the image is circled in red in the picture at the top, and outputs the label. And it will be trained end-to-end with just regular supervised learning. So we'll discuss more choices for these architectures later. But first, let's just work with a simple RNN example. And let's ask the question, well, what are you actually learning when you show this thing a new task? Right, the meta-learning process trains the parameters of the whole LSTM, and that's kind of the outer process. What happens when you give it a new task, a new training set, which, following the image here, will just consist of 5 pictures and their labels? Well, here's how we can understand this. Generic learning can be the standard learning, not meta-learning, can be viewed as the process of taking some loss function and some training set dtrain and recovering the best model parameters theta star. And we can call it some function. We'll call it flearn of dtrain. So flearn takes in dtrain and it produces theta star. What are some examples of flearn that we learned about? Well, gradient descent, atom, SGD with momentum. These are all instances of flearn. Generic meta-learning can be viewed as the problem of taking a number of tasks, in this case n tasks, and minimizing the sum over those n tasks of the loss function on the test set dtest I with respect to some parameter vector phi I, where phi I is given by a learned learning function f theta applied to dtrain I. Okay, so this is a little bit kind of tricky for us to wrap our head around. Let me say that again. For every single task, you have a training set and a test set. You have dtrain I and dtest I, and you have n of these. So you have n different training sets, each one with a corresponding test set. So the rows in the picture here correspond to dtrain dtest pairs. The thing with the green outline is dtrain, the thing with the red outline is dtest. Okay? Your learned learning function, f theta, reads in dtrain I, and it produces some kind of parameters, some vector of numbers that we're going to call phi I. It does not have to correspond to weights of a neural network. It's just some vector of numbers, phi I. And that phi I can be used to classify other images for that same task taken from dtest I. So we'll take an x from dtest I, we'll take phi I, which we obtained from applying f theta to dtrain I, and that will predict the corresponding y, and we'll minimize the loss on that. So it's saying minimize the loss on the test set after using the training set to get phi I. And the gradients from that, of course, are backpropped into f theta. Okay, so that's kind of the abstract model of how MetaLearning works. And I'm going to tell you that this RNN at the top of the slide fits very neatly into this abstract model. In order to figure out how to fit into this abstract model, you have to answer a few questions. You have to answer, well, what is f theta and what is phi? Okay, so let's work on that a little bit. So f theta is the bit that reads in the training set. So for our simple RNN MetaLearner, f theta is basically the RNN. So theta represents the parameters of that RNN. And what does it produce after reading in dtrain? Well, it produces some RNN hidden state. Okay, so this is just the last LSTM state after you've read in the entire training set dtrain. And that last RNN hidden state is used by this little classifier network to classify test points. So we're going to call that p phi I y given x. And what is phi? Well, phi consists of the RNN hidden state as well as the parameters of this little classifier at the end, right? Because that little network that takes in hi and x and produces y, it also has some parameters. And those parameters are meta-learned. So f theta dtrain I produces phi I, and the mental model for how it produces it is most of the knowledge about dtrain is just there in that last RNN hidden state, but also there's the parameters of that classifier. Those parameters are not produced by the RNN, they're just fixed, they're meta-trained, same as everything else. Okay? But from looking at this kind of mental model, you could imagine, well, there are many other ways that you could formulate it. There are many other architectures you could design, many other types of phis you can define. So when I talk about different meta-learning algorithms in the remainder of this lecture, think a little bit about how they map onto this template. Think about what is f theta, what is the bit that reads in dtrain, and what is phi, what is the vector of parameters and numbers that is enough to classify new test points. And there's going to be a different answer for each method that I'll cover. So just to avoid any confusion, everything that I'm describing here is just a different way to look at that RNN. The actual method is very, very simple. The actual method basically treats every dtrain, xy tuple as a training point, feeds dtrain and x as input to the RNN, and teaches it to produce the corresponding y. So it's just a supervised learning problem as far as the RNN is concerned, but viewed in this way, we can think of it also as a meta-learning problem. Okay, so if this seems a little bit confusing to you, just remember that at the end, the way mechanically that you would actually do this is you would just set up a regular sequence to label training problem where the sequence consists of dtrain and then the test point x, and the desired output is just a label that goes with x. So that xy tuple comes from the test set, the sequence is the training set. Okay, so what are some actual meta-learning methods that we can use in practice? Well, we can put them into three categories. The first category I'm going to call black box meta-learning algorithms. And these are basically methods that look like this RNN technique that I described before. They're basically methods that use some kind of neural network, typically a sequence model, to read in the entire training set and the test point, and then output the test point's label. And they're just trained with supervised learning. It's basically recasting the meta-learning problem as a supervised learning problem. And different methods that attempt to do this, they typically differ in the particular architecture that they use for the model that reads in this training set. Because the training set in practice can be quite large. If you have 10-way, 10-shelf classification, you need to read in 100 different XY tuples, so you would need a fairly sophisticated sequence model. So people have used RNNs and LSTMs, memory models, so these are kind of fancy LSTMs that have an external memory, very similar to attention, as well as transformer-style models. So there are a bunch of different architectures that people have tried, but they all basically have the same idea. It's some kind of sequence model that reads in all the xy's in the training set, then reads in the test point, and then outputs the label for the test point. And they're just trained with supervised learning. So we won't actually cover about these black box MetaLearning methods anymore. They differ primarily in their architecture choices, and you can read about those architecture choices in the papers referenced at the bottom as a starting point, but the actual algorithm for training them is exactly what I discussed up until now. So most of the kind of MetaLearning cleverness is really in the data processing. How do you actually separate out your meta-training tasks into individual data points? The second class of MetaLearning methods, which we'll talk about at length in part 2, are non-parametric MetaLearning methods. Don't let the name deceive you. The actual MetaLearning is parametric, but the adaptation is non-parametric. So you can think of these methods as essentially fancy versions of learning how to do nearest neighbor. So the way they'll solve a new task is with some kind of nearest neighbor query, but they will learn representations during the MetaLearning phase that will make those nearest neighbor queries work very well. So these include things like matching networks and prototypical networks. And we'll talk about both of those in part 2. And then the third class of MetaLearning methods are grading-based MetaLearning algorithms. And these at first seem very different from the others, but in many ways they actually have a lot of parallels. So grading-based MetaLearning methods operate on the principle that the way that you will adapt to a new task is just by fine-tuning with gradient descent. So you'll actually adapt to the new task by running gradient descent on that task. But during meta-training, you will actually train your model so that gradient descent adaptation works well. And this at first seems like a totally different principle, but we'll learn how it actually ends up looking fairly similar once we implement it properly.